You know, they called me to help with All In Ministry because when people see me, they think fun. They think full of energy. No, when you think about all of the ways that God has uniquely equipped and positioned us as a church to be for our valley, to reach out and to help every person in this valley encounter Christ and live the full and free lives he created them to live. This is one of those areas where we've just noticed God working over the last few years through things like Night to Shine, which provides a prom-type experience for people with different abilities and disabilities. We just think, okay, part of what it means to love our valley well is to be a place where families and people of all different abilities can really figure out what it looks like to engage in the body of Christ together. So it's really exciting to see how God has been leading us, and would encourage you to do what Jamie said and be praying for people in this ministry as it gets started, and be praying about how God might be inviting you to be a part of that in different ways, because God is on the move here in some really cool ways. This morning, I really am glad that you could be with us today, because we're finishing up this series on the Old Testament book of Genesis that we've been in for the last couple of months. So Genesis is all about beginnings, right? Genesis tells the story of the beginning of God's work in this world, about how he created the world and created humanity to live in a right relationship with him and with each other and with the world around them. And the only thing that humanity had to do to keep this good thing going was to trust God. To trust that God's design for life, God's way to live was in fact the right way to live. And this idea of trust is one that comes up over and over again in the book of Genesis. In many ways, it's kind of the central question of the book. For different characters as they go through the story, as they face opportunities and dilemmas, the question they have to ask themselves is, am I going to trust God? Or am I going to do what seems right in my own eyes? Because when people trust God, things seem to go well. When you do what's right in your own eyes, things begin to fall apart. So in Genesis 3, for example, people turned their back on God, did what was right in their own eyes, didn't trust him. And all those beautiful relationships that we were created to live in with God and with each other, all of those relationships became warped and damaged. And when we look around at our world, we still see the impact of that all around us today. But the amazing thing about the book, right, is that even from the very beginning, even from the moment when humanity turned their back on God, God was ready with a plan to rescue us. Right there in Genesis 3, even as he's laying out for people the consequences of the sinful decisions that they've made, he begins to make a promise to them. A promise that one day someone would come, this offspring of a woman, a person would be born who would trust God fully, who would truly live life God's way, and as God empowers him, that person would crush the forces of death and evil under their heel once and for all. And God makes this promise, and all throughout the book of Genesis, he begins to put this promise into action. So he picks one man, Abraham, and he says, okay, Abraham, it's through you and your descendants, your family. That's where this person, the offspring of the woman, that's where this person will be born. And we've seen how he worked through Abraham, and then through Abraham's son Isaac, and then Isaac's son Jacob. And for the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the next generation down, the 12 sons of Jacob. And one of the things that we've seen again over and over again is that even though the human beings that God chooses to work through sometimes are very faithless in their response to him, God is always faithful. Right? God is absolutely faithful. He is committed to coming through and delivering on the promise that he made to work through Abraham's family to bless all of the nations on earth. Right? Humanity's faithlessness does not trump God's faithfulness. So to round out the story, what I want to do is invite you to turn with me in the Bible today to Genesis chapter 42. If it would help you for any reason, we have some red Bibles in those seats around you, and you can grab one of those and turn to the page number that's there on the screen. But let me kind of get you up to speed on the story, because we're talking about the sons of Jacob today. So Jacob had 12 sons, and a couple of them play a fairly prominent role in the story. So Joseph is son number 11, and he's kind of his daddy's favorite. We'll see why in a little while. But Jacob really singles him out, and he gives him this special coat that kind of shows the love and the favor that he has. And Joseph is not, he doesn't do things that go over well with his brothers. So for example, in chapter 37, he has these dreams, right, where his brothers are all bowing down to him. And Joseph, with all of the tact and wisdom of a 17-year-old boy, decides it'd be a really good idea to tell his brothers about these dreams, repeatedly. Right? So over and over again, he's talking about how one day they're going to bow down to him. And his brothers, he's dad's favorite. Just the anger builds up until finally they have had enough, and they decide to kill him. So Judah, brother number 4, is kind of the ringleader who's like, we're done with this guy. Let's kill him. And then at the last minute before they kill him, they decide instead that they'll sell him into slavery into Egypt. But they take his special coat that dad had given him, they pour animal blood all over it, and they take it back and they use it to trick their dad into thinking that their brother Joseph had been killed like by a wild animal or something. So that's how the story starts off. And it's been about 20 years from when all those events happened to the events that we're going to be looking at today. And a lot of things happen in those 20 years. Judah, for example, brother number 4, he undergoes a pretty significant change in character because of some other events that we've talked about. And we kind of see the new and improved Judah in action today. And Joseph has had some real ups and downs as well. You know, he goes to Egypt, he spends a little bit of time in prison, and then eventually, because God is with him, he ascends the ladder until he's at a position where he's in second command over the nation of Egypt as a whole. And because God was with him, God kind of gave him this picture of the future. So he knew that there were going to be 7 years of a really great harvest followed by 7 years of famine. So Joseph wisely, during those 7 years of abundant harvest, he stores some stuff up for the lean times. And now that those times have come, famine is starting to spread all over the Mediterranean world. And everybody's starting to run out of food, except for the folks back in Egypt. So this is how the story is going to start out today. That's kind of what's going on in the moment. But we're not actually starting out in Egypt. We're starting in the land of Canaan, where Jacob is with the 11 sons that he's still got left. And as we're going to see at the beginning of that chapter, that the famine is really starting to spread there. So in verse 1 it says this. It says, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? He continued, I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die. Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. Okay, so Jacob had 4 different wives, right? He fathered his 12 sons with 4 different wives, but of those 4 wives, he had a clear favorite, Rachel. So Rachel is the biological mom of just 2 of his 12 kids, Joseph and Benjamin. And because of his love for Rachel, he's got a real soft spot in his heart for these 2 boys, because Rachel actually ended up dying in childbirth with Benjamin. So he's lost the love of his life, but he's kind of projected that onto these 2 sons who now have this special place, right? That's part of why Joseph was his favorite. But remember, he thinks Joseph is dead, right? The brothers have tricked him, so he thinks he's gone. So Benjamin is the only living connection he still has to the wife that he loved, that he's lost. So when it's time to send all these sons down to go buy the grain and bring it back, he doesn't want Benjamin to go with him. Because he's like, well, I've already lost one of the 2 sons that I actually care about. You know, the other 10, they can go, but, you know, not Benjamin. You can't take him. So he decides to keep him there. And the other 10 brothers go down to Egypt. And this is where the story, it's just such a great story. You've got like mistaken identity, and anyway, it's just wonderful. Okay, so in verse 6, we'll see what happens. So Joseph, right, brother number 11, Joseph was governor of the land. So he's the person who actually sells the grain to all the people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. Oh, we're from the land of Canaan, they replied. We're just here to buy food. And although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. And then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. Okay, so again, at this point, Joseph's been in Egypt for somewhere around 20 years. And it's not a surprise that his brothers don't recognize him. Because right, when they sold their annoying kid brother into slavery 20 years ago, they never would have expected that he's going to end up being the number 2 guy in Egypt, right? But he recognizes them. And what did they do? They start bowing down to him, right? Remember the dreams that he had back in chapter 37 where the brothers were going to bow down to him? Well, those dreams are finally starting to come true, even though it's taken a while. And Joseph, knowing that who his brothers are and knowing that they don't recognize him, he kind of has them over a barrel, right? So he's in a unique position, and he decides to mess with his brothers just a little bit and to start to do some things to test them, to maybe see how they've changed, if at all, in the last 20 years. So he says, okay, you guys are spies. And then in the discussion, they're trying to clear their name. They're like, we're not spies, we're all brothers. And he's like, what, 10 brothers? And they're like, actually, there's 12 of us. Well, one of them is back at home, and one is no more. I mean, just imagine how that lands on Joseph's ears, right? One of them's no more. They're talking about him. He's like, yeah, that brother's only no more because you sold me into slavery, right? So he's like, no, you guys are spies. And he decides, okay, this is what we're going to do. Because he's now heard them talking about Benjamin, his full brother. And he knows that Benjamin's still alive. Benjamin's back at home. So he decides to do this. In verse 14, he says, Joseph said to them, look, it's just as I told you. You're spies. And this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you, the other 9, you're going to have to stay in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for a few days. Okay, so the original threat is that he's going to put all 9 of them, he's going to leave 9 in prison, and he's just going to send 1 back home. But then he kind of reverses the decision there, and he says, no, you know what? I'll let 9 of you go back home with the food you bought, and I'm only going to keep 1 of you here in prison. He says, but if you ever want to buy food here again, right, because this famine may last a while, and if you ever want to get this brother out of prison, you're going to have to bring your youngest brother back with you. And this is where just some of the details of the story are just so great, right? Because it says that the brothers begin to speak to each other in Hebrew, right? Now, up until this point, to kind of keep the illusion going, Joseph, even though he speaks Hebrew, he's been speaking to them through a translator. So they think they're having this private conversation that he can't overhear, but he's, kind of standing there listening in. So the brothers talk to each other. They say, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother," right? They're referring to what they did to Joseph. "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Now, that's an interesting little detail about what happened back in 37 that's not actually given to us in chapter 37. Right? Chapter 37, they just say, they put him in a pit, and then, they sold him into slavery. But here we realize that when they put him in the pit, Joseph was begging for his life. He was screaming, he was crying, like, "Don't leave me here. Guys, what are you doing? Please, rescue me." And they ignored him. I imagine they're just like sitting there eating their lunch thinking, "Man, when is this kid going to shut up and die already?" So they realize, okay, God's punishing us for this. And Joseph, hearing all of this, is kind of overcome, right? So it says that he turned away from them and began to weep. But then he came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them, right? So Simeon is brother number 2, and bound before their eyes. So brother number 2, he draws the short straw, right? So he's the one who has to stay there in prison. But then Joseph does something strange. He sends the other 9 brothers back with all the food that he collected, but he puts their money back in their bag. Like the money they've paid for the food, he has his guys like slip it into their bag. And he gives us this really important little detail in there because he tells us what kind of money it is. He says it's silver, right? So he puts the silver back in their bag, and the brothers all leave. And then they travel for a little while, and like they make camp for the night, and they open up their bags to get out some food for dinner, and all their money is in there. And they're just like, "Whoa, what is going on? Maybe this is God punishing us somehow." They have no idea what to do, so they just go home, right? They go home, and they're just trying to start to tell their dad what's going on. Now, here's a question. What is going on here? When I was a kid, I remember hearing this story and reading this story and thinking, like, is Joseph just like a jerk? I mean, what is he doing to his brothers? Why is he torturing them? Like, this just doesn't make any sense. But I think one of the real keys to understanding what the author is driving at is actually wrapped up in that little detail about the money, right? What kind of money was it that he was given? It was silver. Now, do you know the one other time in the story of Joseph when silver money has shown up before? It shows up back in chapter 37 when he's sold into slavery in Egypt. It says that he's sold for 20 shekels of silver. Right? So this is what the author is doing here. Right? Joseph is creating a test for his brothers to see if they've changed at all in the last 20 years. He's doing everything he can to recreate the events of chapter 37 to see if they make the same decision now that they made back then. Again, think about what happened in chapter 37, right? The big group of brothers toss one of them into a pit, and they abandon him, right? In that case, by selling him into slavery, and they walk away with their pockets full of silver. So right here in this chapter, Joseph recreates that. He takes one of the brothers, puts him in the pit in prison, and he gives them their money back. And the question for the brothers now is, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? They've got the money. They've got that brother in the pit. They've got the food they came for. Are they just going to go off and abandon one of their brothers in the pit again? Or has something changed this time? I mean, it's really a pretty crafty move by Joseph, the way he puts it together. So let's see how the brothers are going to respond to this. They end up going back, and they got to explain to their dad what happened. Because, Simeon's not there, and they're like, okay, well, here's the deal. There was this guy in Egypt. He had all these questions. He thought we were spies. No, we're 12 sons of the same man. Anyway, long story short, Dad, we've got the food, but Simeon's in jail. And if we ever want to get him out, and if we ever want to buy food from there again, we're going to have to take Benjamin back with us. And so they get ready to do that. They make plans. They want Benjamin to come back because it kind of shows that the brothers have changed some. They want to bring him back to prove their honesty and get Simeon out of jail. But at this point in the story, it's Jacob that says no, right? So Jacob's not going to let him do it. He says, you have deprived me of my children. Now stop and think about this for a second. He's talking to 9 of his children right here. But he says, you've basically taken away all of the sons that I care about, right? Joseph is gone, and Simeon's no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me. I mean, just think about how Judah and the other brothers must have felt. Like, you guys mean nothing to me, right? The sons that really matter, you want to take those now? So Jacob's not on board with that. He's not going to let Benjamin go. But Reuben, the oldest brother, tries to make some kind of compromise here. So in verse 37, he says this. He says, Reuben says to his father, look, you can put both of my sons to death if I don't bring Benjamin back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back. But Jacob said, my son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left, as he says this to the 9 other brothers. If harm comes to him on the journey you're taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow. So Reuben makes a really terrible offer to him. He's like, hey, if I don't come back, you can kill my sons. So think about where that leaves Jacob. So if Reuben doesn't come back, it means he's lost Joseph, he's lost Reuben, he's lost Simeon, he's still in jail, and now he has to kill 2 of his own grandchildren. So Jacob's like, this is not a kind of deal that I really want to take you up on. We're just not going to do this. He kind of puts the kibosh on that. But they can't avoid the issue forever because the famine's still there. And eventually, they run out of food. And at the start of chapter 43, they run out of food. So Jacob, eventually he pulls the boys back together and he's like, hey, why don't you go down to Egypt, buy just a little bit more food? And Judah's like, it's not that easy, Dad. Remember, there's a guy down there who says, we can't come back and buy more food unless we bring Benjamin. And Jacob is just distraught, right, at the thought of possibly losing the only son that he still likes. So Judah makes an offer. And as we read through this, compare what Judah offers to what Reuben offered just a few verses before. So look at this in verse 8. It says, then Judah said to Israel, his father, send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life. Right, so let's talk about Judah here for just a minute. So just like in chapter 37, at a really critical moment of the story, he speaks up. In chapter 37, he speaks up to say, hey, I got a great idea. Let's kill our brother or sell him into slavery. But here, he speaks up again and says, listen, right? Reuben was like, hey, if I don't come back, go ahead and kill your grandkids, kill my sons. And Judah says, no, if I don't bring him back, hold me responsible. If I don't bring him back, you can take me in his place. Now, if you were here last week when we talked about Judah and Tamar, just think about the change this represents in Judah, right? The beginning of chapter 38, Judah is only thinking about himself. How does he look out for himself? How does he make sure that his family line keeps going? But there's this remarkable change that happens to him when his daughter-in-law says, hey, you got me pregnant. And I know that is a very weird story, so if you missed that sermon last week, you can watch that online and get up to speed on that. But when Judah is confronted with his sinful choices, he's really broken. He really does begin to change on the inside. And it's here that you begin to see that change start to show up in the story. Right now, instead of just looking out for himself, he's looking out for somebody else. Now he's offering himself as a guarantee. Right now, instead of just thinking about what can he do to keep his family line going, he's thinking about the grief that his father is going to experience, right? The same father who basically has just insulted him over and over again by saying, you're not really one of the sons that I care all that much about, right? He doesn't want his father to experience grief. So he offers to substitute himself for Benjamin. Well, at this point, Jacob's out of options because they're out of food. So he goes ahead and he agrees to let Judah go and take Benjamin with him. And he decides, okay, you know what, why don't you guys go, take twice the amount of money that you took before. Maybe there was some kind of accounting error or something like that, and that's why the money came back. So if you get down there and they're like, hey, you still owe us for the last round, you can pay for that, and you've got money to buy more food. So they all come down, and Joseph, seeing Benjamin, right, his full brother, seeing that Benjamin is with him, he gets Simeon out of jail. And he starts to put another very elaborate test in place for his brothers. He's doing it again. But this time, he sort of raises the stakes. So he starts by doing some things to single Benjamin out so that he looks like the favorite. Because again, what caused all the problem between Joseph and his brothers in the beginning? It's that Joseph was his dad's favorite. That's what made him so angry that they decided to kill him and sell him into slavery. So now Benjamin is here. So he invites them all to dinner, and everybody gets a plate of food, and Benjamin gets 5 times as much food as everybody else. He gets all these honors heaped on him. It's like Joseph's trying to sort of egg his brothers on and see, like, is this going to get some of that jealousy going again? What are they going to do? So he does all that. And then he goes ahead and sells them the food, but he tells the guys again, hey, put all the money back in their bags, and go ahead and take my special silver cup and put that in Benjamin's bag. And then he kind of sends them off to go home again. And then he waits 5 minutes or something like that. And he sends his troops after him, and they go and they catch up to him. And they're like, what are you guys doing? One of you guys stole Joseph's cup. Oh, except not Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph. One of you stole our master's cup. And the brothers are like, wait, nobody did that. And they're like, oh, we think you did. We want to look through your bags. And they're like, fine. And tell you what, we are so sure that we're innocent. If you look into our bags, and it says this, it says, if any of your servants is found to have it, he will die. And the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. And at this point, I imagine, Joseph is just like, oh man, this is coming together so well. Because of course they find the cup in Benjamin's bag because that's where he told his guys to put it. But Joseph's like, what, I'm not going to take you up on your offer. I'm not going to kill Benjamin and make the other 9 of you stay in prison forever. You 9 can go free, but Benjamin is going to have to stay in prison. Right? So think about what he's doing here. This is so brilliant. He's recreated the test of chapter 37 again, but this time the stakes are even higher. Once again, you've got this beloved brother who's there in the pit, in prison. But now, all the other boys in the family, they've got twice as much money as they had last time. And they've got all the food that they're going to need to live for a while. And he says, you all are free to go. So they're in the very same position that they were in before, right? The son's life is hanging in the balance. They can take the money and run. What are they going to do? Are they going to abandon their brother again? Or has something actually changed? And this is where Judah speaks up. And you begin to see that there really has been a transformation in the brothers. And he starts to talk to Joseph about the pain and the grief that it will cause his father if he doesn't bring the boy back. He says, so now, if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. So this is Judah talking about himself. He says, your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. And then here it comes, right? This is the moment where you really begin to see the change in Judah. It says, now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? He says, no, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. Right, and at that point, he's sort of giving himself up for his brother. At that point, the gig is up. So Joseph just loses it, right, because he sees this change that's happened. So it says this. It says, and Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everybody leave my presence, right? So he makes all the Egyptians that are with him leave. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, right? They're on the other side of the wall like, what is going on in there? And Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land. And for the next 5 years, there's going to be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So Joseph kind of announces himself to his brothers, and they realize that, beyond all imagining, Joseph is still alive. And over the next few chapters, the brothers travel back to their father, and they give their father the news that Joseph is actually still alive. And soon Jacob and all the sons and all their wives and the whole extended family, right? Everybody moves down to Egypt, where Joseph is able to provide for them, where he's able to feed them and care for them during this famine. And then sometime after that reunion, Jacob, the father, who's very old at this point, he passes away. But there's one last part of the story that I want us to look at, and it takes place right near the end in chapter 50. So it happens just after Jacob has died. So in verse 15 of that chapter, it says this. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him, right? What if he's just been nice to us while Dad was alive and he's been biding his time until Dad is gone and he's going to drop the hammer on us? So they do what their father, the trickster Jacob, always does. They make something up. So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. And listen to this. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Right here, the sons of Jacob, right, they kind of fall back on the tricky ways of their father again because they're afraid and they're trying to save their own skin. So why did they make this up, right? Jacob never said this. Why did they make this up? Right, they make it up because they can't imagine a world where forgiveness like this exists. Right? They cannot imagine a reality where Jacob would really forgive them for what they had done. I mean, he said he forgave them, but in their mind, they're thinking about that day when he's in the pit begging for his life, and they just ignore him. Right? They think about all the damage that their decisions have brought into his life, and they're starting to think, well, maybe that forgiveness he's talking about isn't so real. Now stop and think about that for a second. Have you ever done anything like that? Have you ever fallen into a trap of thinking that whatever you have done is so bad, you can't really have been forgiven by God or by somebody else? Or that maybe you simply couldn't be forgiven? Right? I think at times in our lives, we just have a hard time receiving the gift of grace, whether that's from God or whether that is from other people that we care about, other people that we have hurt. And when we do that, right, when we have been forgiven, but we don't believe that we've been forgiven, that's a pretty dangerous place to be. Because what that pushes us to do is it pushes us to live out of an identity that is not true. Right? When we have been forgiven by God, when we've been forgiven by other people, we need to believe that to be true and live out of that identity. But if you fall into this trap of thinking, I don't think they mean it, or I don't think that could really apply to me, what you end up doing is that drives you to make decisions that end up causing more and more damage in the relationships that you care about. I mean, that's what happens with Joseph's brothers. They don't believe that they've been forgiven, so they start lying to him. They start trying to manipulate them. And when they do that, what does the text say that Joseph does? Right? He weeps. He weeps. He's hurt that they don't believe that he really could forgive them. He's hurt that they don't believe that he really has extended this grace and forgiveness to them. He's hurt because he sees that they're not acting out of what's true about them, that they are loved and forgiven, but instead they're relating to him with fear. And that's why he cries when he does that. So when they come and when they throw themselves down in front of him, this is what he says. He says, don't be afraid. Right? Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And in that line right there, Joseph pretty much summarizes the whole book of Genesis, right? You intended it for harm, but God intended it for good, to accomplish something wonderful that is now happening, the saving of many lives. Right? That's Genesis in a nutshell. God is faithful, even when his people are faithless. Right? By God's sheer grace, the promise that he made to bring the offspring of a woman, that promise is kept alive through questionable people and the really terrible decisions that they make. And it shows that God's plans are not going to get sidetracked if people don't trust him. Because what some intended for evil, God found a way to transform for good. And this brings up an idea that I really love about Genesis. I don't fully understand it and confuses me sometimes. But it is definitely something that you see in this story. Sometimes you read through this chapter and you think, okay, well, who's the driver of this story? Like, whose decisions really matter? Is this happening because this is God's will? Or is this happening because of the choices that people made? Right? It's that old question, right? Is it God's sovereignty or human free will? And if you go to the book of Genesis and say, which one is it? Is it God's sovereignty or human free will? The book of Genesis says yes. Which is weird because that's an either-or question the way that we frame it up, and we're not expecting an answer like that. But really what the book of Genesis tries to say is that both of these things somehow matter. And you see it right in chapter 45 and what Joseph says, right? Says this, he says, "And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Did you catch that? It's in one sentence. You sold me here, God sent me here, right? Somehow both of those things are true at the same time. And the author of Genesis doesn't try to solve that riddle for us. Instead, I think they just invite us to live in that tension of understanding that both of those things are true and that both of those things matter. And living in that tension is important because it keeps us from kind of falling off the road in one side or the other. Because it's pretty dangerous to come over here and be like, it's all up to God and his sovereignty. So in one sense, doesn't really matter what I do because God's going to get his stuff done whether I make the right decisions or not. So I can pretty much do whatever I want and God's got it taken care of, right? Or you could go too far in this direction and be like, oh my gosh, I have got to get this perfect. If I mess this up, God is really in trouble. What is he going to do if I don't get this right? Right? What the book of Genesis is trying to show us is that somehow both these things are true. God's will is going to get done. And yet, because of his grace, because of the way he set this up, our decisions contribute to that and work in that in some way that we don't fully understand. And it's a challenge for us to live in that tension and say, okay, God, I don't know how this all works, but I want to play my part well. And I recognize just when I look at my own life that I'm not going to be able to pull this off well on my own. I need you. I need your help. I need the power of your Spirit to actually do this. And that's the other big idea I think that you see over and over in the book of Genesis. Right from chapter 3 when it talks about the offspring of the woman who's going to come. The book of Genesis as a whole points to our need for a Savior outside of ourselves to come into the scene and rescue us. Because we cannot trust God perfectly on our own. We cannot pull this off on our own. In the book of Genesis, when you see the story of God's faithfulness repeated over and over again, this book was written to inspire our confidence in the fact that God is able to fulfill the promise that he made to us. Right? And for followers of Jesus, we look at the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ and we say, that's where that promise really came to fulfillment in a powerful and in a way that marks our lives to this day. Because while some people were intending some things with Jesus for evil, right, God can still use that to actively accomplish good, including the saving of many lives. So as we end this series, I just want to challenge us. What do we need to do to put this into practice in our lives? It could be that some of us, we find ourselves in the very same position that Joseph's brothers are in. Like we have experienced grace and forgiveness from God and from other people. But at some level, that just kind of hadn't taken root in our heart. In some level, we just don't feel like we're worthy of that it could really apply to us, that it is true for us. Right? We look at what we've done and we think, yeah, that forgiveness could help other people, but not us. But you've got to remember, if you are here today and you are a follower of Jesus Christ, the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus has made it possible for you to be truly forgiven for all of your sins, put back into a right relationship with him, and been given the gift of the Holy Spirit to actually live the way that God invites us to live. And when you stop and think about that offer, that is just an astounding picture of grace. It is so astounding that sometimes we have a hard time believing that it could really be true for somebody like me, for somebody like you. But it is, right? And the New Testament authors over and over again remind us that we've been washed and cleansed by the love and the grace of God. And then they encourage us to deeply and daily rely on the power of God's Holy Spirit to live out of that new reality, to live out of that new identity, to experience his grace and forgiveness. So maybe today we just need to ask God to help us truly believe that we are forgiven and then to trust him enough to actually start living that way. Or for others of us, maybe we just need to be reminded of the central truth of the story of Joseph that we've seen the last few weeks. That even when it looks like he has abandoned us, God is always with us. Even when we look at the circumstances around us and we don't see that God is present, we can trust that he is there, that he is working for us, working for his good in our lives. And while the circumstances may not look good, God can use them to do a good thing, not just for us, but to actually reach out through that and accomplish something good, right? The saving of many lives. God can use even our difficult circumstances to be a blessing to other people. Right, because that's where Abraham's promise was going. It ended with the nations, all the nations on the earth being blessed. So in just a moment, we're going to sing a final song. And I just want to invite you as we do that to use the words of that song and the time that you have during that to just kind of ask, okay, God, what do I need to do with all of this? What are you trying to say to me through the text that we've looked at today, the text that we've looked at in the last couple of months? And then I just want to pray that as you hear from him, because we believe that the living God wants to speak to each and every one of us this morning. So we pray that as you hear from him, his Spirit would give you the courage to act on what you've heard. So with that in mind, would you pray for me, with me? You pray for me too. God, thank you. Thank you for the stories that we see in the book of Genesis. I admit, there are some things in here that I'm like, God, if you could have cleared up this whole free will sovereignty thing a little bit more cleanly, I would appreciate that. The intellectual side of me would just love to have some definition there. And yet, God, some things, because of your will and the way you set things up, they're just a mystery that it's kind of hard for us to fully wrap our brains around. And yet, Lord, even in the midst of that, there's some things in this book that are abundantly clear. They're so clear that we sometimes just have a hard time accepting that they could be true, that you could truly forgive us, that your love really is enough to bring us back to you and to bridge the gap. So God, as we prepare to sing this final song, we just ask that you would do what no one can do but you, that you would speak to each human mind and each human heart, that you would take what we've talked about today or what we've experienced this week or what we've talked about in this series, and you would just bring that truth, Lord. Bring to each of our minds what we need to see, what we need to hear, so that we can truly experience you, God, and experience your Spirit and your forgiveness and your grace in a way that helps us really step into and live the full and free lives you created us to live. We ask all these things in your name.